was just a joke. Maybe she was being mean. Again, we don't know the details, but we do know that she swipes her phone from her. And Cheyenne doesn't like this one bit, and she is pissed. How's she gonna take my phone from me? So they start getting into it and arguing, and this argument gets heated. In fact, it gets so heated that eventually Cheyenne just snaps. And pow, she hits Brittany, and then pow, she hits her again, and again, and again, and she just overpowers her. And then, allegedly, while Brittany's down, Cheyenne takes off this braided black belt that she's wearing, and she wraps it around Brittany's neck, and she starts strangling her, and no matter how hard Brittany fights, Cheyenne just won't let go of that belt. And when she finally stops, Brittany is no longer moving, and she won't wake up. And Cheyenne, she panics because, like, her friend might be dead. And I guess, at that point, she puts lifeless Brittany in the car, and then she gets in, and she hauls ass out of there. Now, at this point, she could drive her friend to the hospital to get her medical attention. But that's not what she does. Instead, she drives over to her aunt's house. And I guess she goes over to her aunt, and she's still totally wasted, by the way. She goes to her aunt, and she's like, I beat up my friend, and I choked her out, and now she's not waking up for some reason. And Aunt, she looks in the car, and she can see Brittany looking all beat up and slumped over against the window. And Aunt wants no part of this. She's like, nah, you need to leave. Which, I don't blame her. Like, yeah, you bring an unconscious body to my house? Like, nah, you need to get the f*** out. But anyway, so Cheyenne leaves. Now, here is another point where Cheyenne could drive her friend to the hospital and get her medical attention, but again, that's not what she does. Instead, she drives out near a landfill on the edge of town, and she dumps Brittany by the side of the road, and she just leaves her there. And then I guess she goes home and just passes out. The next day, Cheyenne wakes up, and she claims she doesn't remember what happened the night before, and that it's a total blackout. Sure, Cheyenne. But she definitely notices that she doesn't have a phone, because she gets on Facebook, and she goes to Brittany's page, and she posts on her wall, like, hope you got home safely, I need my phone. Now, obviously, Brittany didn't get home safely, because Cheyenne dumped her on the side of the road. In fact, while Cheyenne was passed out at home, someone came along and found Brittany's body lying in a ditch. And by this point, she's completely unresponsive, and as you can guess, she ultimately doesn't make it. And so now, police gotta get involved, because there's a random body in a ditch, and boom, they immediately start investigating. And they're looking at the crime scene where Brittany's body was found, and they don't find much, but they do find the black braided belt that she was strangled with. And once the body is identified as Brittany, they start looking at her social media. And they notice the last thing she posted on Facebook the night she was unalived is that selfie she took with Cheyenne. So now, pow, Cheyenne is a person of interest. And so police go and they question her, which is apparently easy to do because she was apparently already in custody for a completely different crime she had committed. I told you she was a turd. But police question Cheyenne, and Cheyenne decides to lie to them. And she tells them that, yeah, she did go out that night. And she went to this house party, and that afterwards, she and Brittany went to this place called the Colonial Pub and Grill. And she says they met a guy there, and then that guy and Brittany dropped her off at her uncle's place. I don't know, it's some bullshit excuse. So then police go and investigate Colonial Pub and Grill, and they look at surveillance footage from that night, and there is no sign of Cheyenne or Brittany ever being there. Also, police discover that Cheyenne never visited her uncle that night. So now they've caught her in a couple of lies, and to them, she's starting to look suspicious. Meanwhile, this whole time, Cheyenne is posting things to Brittany's Facebook wall. I guess she's trying to make herself look not guilty. She's posting things like, I miss you, you were in my dreams last night. Or this one, I miss you so much, I wish heaven had visiting hours so I could come see you. Now, unfortunately for her, this isn't gonna work, because rumors have already started to circulate. Because remember, Cheyenne's aunt saw them that night. She saw Cheyenne with Brittany's body in the car. And so rumors start to spread, and word gets back to Brittany's family that Cheyenne's aunt had saw them that night of the murder, and that Cheyenne showed up in the middle of the night, panicking, claiming that she hurt her friend. So of course, Brittany's family goes and reports all this to the police. So now, police are even more suspicious of Cheyenne. But unfortunately, they can't arrest her because they simply don't have enough evidence. Until 2 years go by, and detectives are working on this case, and they still can't figure it out. Now, they're pretty sure Cheyenne's involved, but they can't tie her directly to the crime, not in a way that's good enough to prosecute her. But then, one of the detectives is looking through all the evidence again, and they come across that selfie that the girls took that night. And they look at it one last time, and that is when they finally see it. Boom, it's right there in the photo.
Yep.
Cheyenne is wearing a black braided belt. The same belt that they found at the crime scene. So she's wearing the murder weapon hours before the murder. And so, bam, police arrest Cheyenne. And I don't have a mugshot, but here's what she looks like in real life. And they charge her with second-degree murder, but she takes a plea deal and she pleads down to manslaughter, and she only gets 7 years in prison. So, shout out to Saskatoon.
Dang, that was heavy. Heavy stories.
Kind of a pervert. And Bill has a problem. He's kind of a pervert. He's a weird guy. And one day, Bill goes online and he starts trolling in chat rooms. And Bill is 56, and he ends up chatting with someone much younger than him. This kid, who we'll call 13, because he's 13. Now, Bill doesn't tell 13 that he's a 56-year-old man. He pretends he's much younger. He's essentially catfishing this kid. Regardless, Bill and 13, they chat for a while and they hit it off, and Bill starts flirting with him, and eventually Bill sends him photos. Inappropriate photos. And their conversations get pretty dirty. It's gross. But here's the important thing about 13. He's not really 13. 13 isn't a kid at all, actually. He's actually a group of adult vigilantes who pose as teenagers because they're trying to catch P3DOs. So Bill isn't chatting with 13, he's actually chatting with an adult. And these vigilantes are working with To Catch a Predator. And To Catch a Predator is a famous TV show hosted by this guy, Chris Hansen. And the whole idea of To Catch a Predator is to catch predators and expose them on television for the world to see. And sometimes police are with them and arrests are made. It's actually a really good show. And it's really popular. I guess because people just like seeing them ambush predators. And that is what the show is planning on doing to Bill. So this covert operation goes on for about 2 weeks. Bill chats with this fake teenage boy. And by that point, the vigilantes feel like they have a lot of evidence with these adult conversations that they've been having online, so they decide it's time to trick Bill into meeting up with 13 so they can run in and ambush him with the cameras and bust him. So they hire an actor to pretend to be 13 to talk to Bill on the phone. So then Bill and fake 13, they talk on the phone and they agree to meet up, and To Catch a Predator is recording this whole call.
Are you gonna come over? Is it okay?
Avec 10 croquettes.
Sure.
Totally.
And of course, they talk about the things they're gonna do once they meet up.
And what do you want to do?
Whatever you'd like to do.
Je sais pas, il dort.
Gross. And so, Bill agrees to come over and meet. But, strangely, when the time comes, Bill never shows up. And so the undercover crew, they keep trying to get him to meet, but from there, Bill just kind of disappears. Like he suddenly stops answering his phone and responding to messages, and they can't figure out why. Now, here's the thing about Bill. Bill isn't just some regular old pervert. Bill is actually the assistant district attorney for the county. So he's a prosecutor. In fact, he's been a prosecutor for more than 20 years, suggesting that he's probably prosecuted a few predators in court himself. So, being an assistant district attorney, he's kind of a high-profile guy, locally, which makes this ambush a big deal. And when Chris Hansen and the undercover crew discover that he's an assistant district attorney, they know this is gonna be really good TV. and that this episode is gonna be huge. They busted other predators in the area, but nothing like this. However, Bill still isn't showing up, and he's still not answering his phone. And this throws a monkey wrench into their whole operation. Because if he doesn't agree to meet up, then Chris and the crew, they can't run out and ambush him with the camera like they planned. So they decide they can't just let this opportunity go. They have to take a different approach. And so then Chris, he hits up the local police and he tells them what's going on. And he asks them to get search and arrest warrants for Bill. Because the plan is, when police go to Bill's house to arrest him, Chris and the To Catch a Predator crew will be there with the cameras to capture the whole thing. Anyway, so the police agree to help, and they work through the night to get everything in order, and by morning time, they have what they need. So they all head over to Bill's house, because they're about to arrest him. And by the way, Bill has no idea any of this is going on. Now, at Bill's house, Chris Hansen and the rest of the TV crew, they're already over there. They're waiting outside, and they're kind of being low-key, like hiding behind trees and stuff. Like, they don't want to alert Bill, but I don't think they're doing a very good job of being low-key. Regardless, police get there, and an officer goes to the door, and he knocks, but no answer. However, one of the officers can see inside through a window, and he can see that a TV and a computer are on. So clearly Bill is home, he's just not answering his door. So then police decide they're gonna have to force their way in, and the SWAT team shows up, and they all head around back to a sliding glass door, and they break the lock. Then the whole SWAT team files inside, and they start sweeping the house. And they finally spot Bill standing there. And Bill, he's got a pew-pew in his hand. And he apparently knows exactly why they're there. Because as soon as he sees them, he steps back inside another room and he yells, "I'm not gonna hurt anyone!" But then he puts the pew-pew up to his temple and he pulls the trigger, unaliving himself. And from there, the story blows up and it hits the news and it gets national attention. Everyone's talking about this. And people start heavily criticizing the show, accusing them of being too focused on TV ratings when instead they should be focused on justice. But despite all that attention, the episode about Bill still airs, and it seems like the show is just gonna go on as normal. Until 9 months later, the district attorney's office announces it will not be prosecuting any of the predators that Chris Hansen outed in that local Texas area. Because some of them, there were some jurisdiction issues, and in other cases, the evidence collected really isn't usable. So, of the 24 men that they had arrested in this area of Texas using the To Catch a Predator sting operations, none of them went to prison. In other areas they did because they shot the show like all around the country, but in Texas, none of them were prosecuted. But then it gets even crazier because Bill's sister, this woman, Patricia learns about her brother's case and what happened to him, and she is really not happy. And she doesn't like how this whole thing was handled. She thinks police illegally raided Bill's home for the sake of TV ratings and that they failed to protect her brother's safety and that all of this led him to unalive himself.
I intend to fight as hard and as long as I can to prevent other people from becoming victims of such reckless actions as those taken by your employees, which were set in motion by a self-appointed group acting as judge, jury, and executioner.
So then, bam, Patricia files a lawsuit against NBC Universal, the network who owns To Catch a Predator. And she actually sues them for $105 million. It's a wrongful death lawsuit. And ultimately, NBC negotiates with her and they end up settling out of court for an undisclosed amount. So it seems like Patricia ended up getting paid quite a bag of money. But then, around this time, sadly, after 4 years on the air, NBC cancels the show To Catch a Predator. And it is speculated that Patricia's lawsuit is what led to the cancellation of the show. However, that is just speculation because to my understanding, NBC never put out an official statement as to why they actually canceled the show. They just kind of suddenly canceled it. That's what they normally do. R.I.P. It was a good show.
Yeah. Why is it not?
He keeps So this may be the worst, most evil pastor I've ever seen. So let's just call him Pastor Tim. And Pastor Tim has a problem. He keeps getting fired. He keeps losing his job at church after church because he's constantly involved in some scandal. Like, he gets fired from one church because they catch him leaving a strip club one night. They're like, hey, isn't that our preacher? He gets fired from another church because they catch him having an affair with one of the members of his congregation. Bro is just a menace. But eventually, he can't be a pastor anymore. So he has to get a regular job working at a county jail in Minnesota. And of course, that goes horribly wrong too. Because one time, there's this prostitute leaving the jail, and Pastor Tim, he starts creeping on her, and he offers her a ride home. And on that ride home, he then proceeds to...
What is wrong with him?
And later, she presses charges against him, and bam, police arrest Pastor Tim, and they sentence him to 6 months in jail.
Fucking idiot is that?
Wow, that's a really light sentence. Okay, but here's the other thing about Pastor Tim, though. He actually has a wife and daughters. So his wife, her name's Janet. And Janet learns about what her husband did to the prostitute, and she's like, fuck all this, and she leaves him, and she takes her daughters, and she moves from Minnesota all the way to Alabama. And months later, Pastor Tim actually gets out of jail, and he moves straight from Minnesota down to Alabama to be closer to Janet and his daughters. And somehow, he convinces Janet that he is a changed man. And unfortunately, Janet takes him back. And so there, in Alabama, Tim gets a job at a local Pentecostal church as a pastor. Now, he obviously doesn't tell them that he's been fired from a bunch of other churches or that he just got out of jail for essaying a prostitute, because then they'd never hire him. No. Instead, he lies on his resume like the rest of us, and Pastor Tim gets this job. And he starts preaching at this church every week, and the people at the church love him. They're like, oh, he's so Christ-like. But unfortunately, Pastor Tim is not, in fact, Christ-like. Because at some point during all this, he starts chatting with this woman online. Her name's Molly. And even though they haven't met in person, Molly thinks Pastor Tim is fine. And so they keep chatting, and they're hitting it off, and they're flirting, and over time, they develop a pretty serious relationship. But of course, Pastor Tim doesn't tell her who he really is. He gives her a fake name, and he doesn't tell her that he's married. He tells her that he's a Navy SEAL or some shit. For the record, he is not, in fact, a Navy SEAL. But anyway, at some point, Pastor Tim starts telling his wife Janet that he has to go out of town on official church business. But of course, there is no official church business. He's just using that as an excuse to sneak away and meet up with Molly. And that's when he flies from Alabama over to Washington State, and he starts smashing with Molly on the side. And so this affair with Molly continues, and over time, things get more and more serious between the two. And Pastor Tim, he ends up leading this double life. He's spending part-time in Alabama with his wife Janet, and part-time in Washington smashing with Molly. And this seems to be working pretty well for him, I guess. Until... eventually, Pastor Tim has been cheating on his wife Janet with Molly for like over a decade now. And that's when he decides to propose to Molly. Even though he's still married to Janet. And of course, she has no idea he's been sneaking off to see this other woman the whole time. So, after the proposal, Tim heads back to Alabama, and he keeps pretending to be a good husband, and he keeps pretending to be a good pastor. But unfortunately, Pastor Tim can't keep up with this lie. So he comes up with an idea to get rid of his wife Janet for good. And so, at the Pentecostal church Pastor Tim preaches at, they have a charity event sometimes. And at this charity event, they all shoot pew-pews for some reason. Welcome to America. And one of the times the church holds one of these events, once the event is over, Pastor Tim takes 3 of the rifles they're using home with him. And when he and Janet get home, Pastor Tim asks her to help him carry the rifles into their house. And he hands her one, and then he takes the other 2, and he follows her through the front door and into their bedroom. And as Tim walks through the doorway, he lifts up one of the rifles, and he aims it at Janet's back, and he pulls the trigger. Blam! And she falls to the ground, and their daughters are home, so the daughters come in, and they're all screaming, and it's this whole horrible scene. And unfortunately, Janet doesn't survive the shot. And so later, police get there and they ask Pastor Tim what happened, and I guess he tells them, it was all an accident. The pew-pew accidentally knocked against something and it just suddenly went off. And so I guess police believe him and they just rule the whole thing an accident. And so this is a horrible situation and everyone is devastated and they're trying to figure out exactly what happened. How did this rifle accidentally go off? And one woman who really wants to know the truth is this
Their
woman,
daughter?
Janet's sister. And Janet's sister hears that Pastor Tim accidentally shot Janet, and she gets suspicious. She always thought Pastor Tim was kind of a shady dude. So Janet's sister sends an email to the local district attorney, and boom, district attorney gets a detective on the case. Now, the detective starts investigating, and he finds out almost immediately that Pastor Tim has 2 driver's licenses for some reason. One with his real name on it, and one with a completely different last name on it. Like he has 2 identities. And so detective keeps digging, and he checks Pastor Tim's phone records, and he sees all these late-night phone calls to a number in Washington State. So he tracks the phone number back to a woman named Molly. And around this same time, Janet's sister, she's still trying to figure out this case too. And she hits up detective and she tells him about this rumor she had heard that Pastor Tim may have had a girlfriend on the side. A girlfriend named Molly. And so, kapow, everything starts clicking into place for the detective. He feels like he knows the truth. That Pastor Tim unalived Janet so that he could be with his side girlfriend, Molly. But unfortunately, there's not enough evidence to charge Pastor Tim with the murder. Until again. One day, Pastor Tim goes and does something really stupid. 3 months after Janet had died, Pastor Tim goes and he forges Janet's name and he takes out a loan for $5,000 in her name. And of course, this gets flagged as suspicious because dead people can't apply for loans. And so detective, he's able to use this information to bring Pastor Tim in and question him about this mysterious loan. And while he's interviewing him about this forgery, he starts asking him about the murder. And he keeps pressing him on it and pressing him. And Pastor Tim's all nervous and he's angry and he keeps changing his story of exactly how it went down and how the pew-pew went off. And around this same time, some other officers working on the case, they track down Molly. And they tell her who Pastor Tim really is. That he's not, in fact, a Navy SEAL. He's a pastor living in Alabama who they suspect unalived his own wife. And they tell her he's been using a fake name and a fake ID to fool her about who he is. That's why he has 2 driver's licenses. And Molly is like, oh snap! And she gets pissed and she flips on him real quick. She starts handing over emails and correspondence with him. She's like, I'll give you whatever information you need. Anyway, eventually police do gather enough evidence against him, and so, bam, they arrest him. Here's his mugshot. And ultimately, Pastor Tim goes to trial twice, and he's found guilty of unaliving his wife, and he's sentenced to life in prison. Good.
That's what you get. You wanted to
So
smash.
the apocalypse is coming, and the
Too
world is
hard.
gonna end, right? And this woman believes she can save us all by unaliving all the zombies? Now, her name is Lori. And Lori's a
Are we
normal
the
housewife
zombies?
living in Arizona, and one day she discovers a series of novels. And these novels are all about the coming apocalypse and how to survive the end of the world.
So
And Lori
Bible?
is very religious, and she's reading these books, and she really connects with them. And as she becomes more and more obsessed with the books, she starts spending less and less time with her kids. And eventually, she decides to travel from Arizona to Utah to a convention where the author of these novels is going to speak. Because she
Oh,
wants to meet
boy.
him. So the author is this guy, Chad Daybell. And Lori gets to meet Chad Daybell, and she's all excited, and she tells him how much his books have changed her life. And these two really hit it off. And they start flirting a little, and Chad Daybell tells her they've been married in previous lifetimes, which I gotta say, that is one hell of a pickup line. So eventually, the convention ends, and they go their separate ways. But Lori and Chad decide to stay in touch, and they chat often. And he has her as a guest on his podcast, Long Distance. And they, of course, often talk about how to prepare your soul for the upcoming apocalypse. Now, because of the popularity of his beliefs, Chad Daybell does have a bit of a religious following. His beliefs are sort of an extreme denomination of Mormonism, which some people describe as a doomsday cult. And the more Lori interacts with Chad Daybell and the more she buys into his doomsday teachings, the more her personality starts to change. And she starts saying crazy things to her friends and family, like that she's a divine goddess, that she has supernatural powers, that she's been reincarnated many, many times, that she is one of only 144,000 people who will actually be saved when the world ends. But most importantly, she starts talking about zombies. And not your Walking Dead, eat your brains type zombies. She and Chad Daybell believe that zombies are a normal person whose soul has been possessed by an evil demon. That's what they refer to as a zombie. And they think there are zombies all around them, hidden in plain sight. Now, Lori actually has a husband, who we'll just call Husband. And at this point in her life, Husband is seeing all these changes in her, and he's starting to get worried, because she's been referring to herself as a goddess and talking about zombies and all kinds of crazy shit. But then, one day, everything changes for Husband, because Lori comes to him and she tells him that she no longer cares about him. And then after that, she just disappears. She steals his truck and she withdraws $35,000 from their joint bank account, and she just bounces. And then 2 months go by and she's still gone and no one knows where she is. But as you could have guessed, everyone suspects that she went to Idaho, where Chad Daybell lives, to be with him. So after 2 months of being gone, one day she suddenly returns. And of course, she and Husband immediately start getting into arguments about all this. And she starts insisting that he is possessed by an evil demon. An evil demon named Ned Schneider. Which, I gotta say, that's not a very demonic sounding name for an evil demon, Ned Schneider, but okay. And then she tells Husband that her God has put her on some kind of holy mission, and that if Husband gets in the way of her holy mission, she will have to unalive him. And Husband is like, okay, what the f***? And he goes and he files for divorce. And then Lori's like, okay, fine. And she takes their 2 kids and she goes to live with her brother. Her brother is this guy, Alex. And Alex is a total religious nut job too. So Lori tells Alex that Husband is actually a zombie and that he's possessed by an evil demon named Ned Schneider. And Alex is like, say no more, I'll take care of him. About 5 months later, Husband comes over to the house that Lori's renting to pick up their son. And while he's there, he and Lori, they start fighting. And Lori's brother Alex is there. And so Alex gets involved in this fight. And at one point, Alex gets so mad, he goes into his bedroom and he gets his pew-pew. And he comes out and he starts threatening Husband with it. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, blam, Alex shoots Husband twice in the chest. And unfortunately, Husband, he doesn't make it. And Alex ends up telling police that it was self-defense, and there are no charges brought against him. Then, about a month after that, Lori takes her 2 kids and her brother Alex, and they all move from Arizona all the way to Idaho. Because, of course, that's where Chad Daybell lives. And now that Husband is gone, she can be closer to him. About a week later, after moving to Idaho, Lori and Alex take her 2 kids on a little trip to Yellowstone National Park. Now, there's not a lot known about what actually happened there that day, but that day is the last day that Lori's daughter is seen alive. Because Lori and Alex, they come back from Yellowstone without her, and no one knows what happened to her. Then, 2 weeks later, Lori's son goes missing. And again, we don't know much about why, because one day he's just gone, and no one knows what happened to him. Now, suspiciously, neither Lori nor her brother Alex report this to the police. And when other relatives and family members call to talk to the kids, Lori just makes up excuses like, oh, they're out with their friends, or, oh, he's taking a nap right now. And everyone believes her. I mean, at this point, they have no reason to suspect that Lori might have done something to unalive her own kids. Until about a month later, Chad Daybell, his wife, because yes, he's also married to someone, Chad Daybell's wife suddenly dies. She dies out of nowhere from cardiac arrest. But the whole thing is sudden and therefore very suspicious. And what's even more suspicious is that Chad Daybell doesn't allow them to perform an autopsy on her. Now, stay with me here because it gets a little complicated. The youngest son, the one who went missing, his name is JJ. And JJ is actually adopted. Now, his biological grandmother, she talks to him like on the phone often enough. And at this point, it's been about 6 weeks since she could get him on the phone last. And every time she calls, Lori keeps making excuses. Like, oh, JJ can't talk right now. He's out playing with the other kids. So at this point, grandmother's getting worried, and she thinks something weird is going on. So she calls police, and she asks them to go do a welfare check. So police, they go over to Lori and Chad Daybell's apartment, and of course, JJ isn't there. And that is when police discover that not only is JJ not there, but both kids are missing. And Lori's brother Alex happens to be there. And Alex, he tells police, JJ's not here, he's staying with his grandmother right now. But remember, it was grandmother who reported JJ missing. So police are like, yeah, that's bullshit, and this is definitely suspicious. And they start really investigating
Where
Lori and
was
Chad.
it?
And about a week later, Lori and
I don't
Chad
even have
move
the
from
time to
Idaho to
fucking
Hawaii.
smash
And
her
once they're in
head.
Hawaii, they get married. And it's only been like 2 weeks since Chad's wife died of alleged cardiac arrest, and he's already getting remarried. And so all this is coming across as super weird. And this whole time, Lori's family is hitting her up like, hey, where are your kids? We haven't spoken to them in forever. And Lori's still making excuses like, oh, they're fine. They're off playing something. And of course, police are also harassing them too. Like, ma'am, where the hell are your kids? And Lori's like, oh no, they're staying with my friend. And the friend is like, her kids aren't with me, what the? So then, boom, police officially declare Lori and Chad as persons of interest. And they launch a nationwide search for these missing kids. And of course, no one can find them. Meanwhile, police are like, you know, maybe these missing kids are somehow related to Chad's former wife's sudden death from cardiac arrest. So they go and they dig up Chad's former wife's body to see if she actually died from cardiac arrest. And they autopsy her, and guess what they find? No, she didn't die from cardiac arrest. She was actually asphyxiated, meaning someone suffocated her. So police, they contact Lori, and they're like, all right, lady, we're tired of your excuses. You have 5 days to physically produce your missing kids, or you're under arrest. And of course, Lori doesn't produce them. She can't. And 3 weeks later, bam, they arrest Lori, and they charge her with abandonment. Here's her mugshot. And while Lori's in jail, police get a warrant, and they search Chad Daybell's backyard at his previous house back in Idaho. And they start digging around in that yard, and there, buried, they find the remains of both of Lori's kids.
No!
And sadly, it is theorized that Lori and Chad beat and strangled them to death. Apparently, Lori and Chad thought her 2 kids had become zombies, and that the only way to save their souls was to get rid of them before the apocalypse happens. So then, of course, kapow! Police arrest Chad. Here's his mugshot. And they charge him and Lori both with first-degree murder for unaliving the kids. They also charge Chad with unaliving his wife, and they charge Lori with conspiring to unalive her former husband. Then they go to trial, and she's found guilty for everything, and he is also found guilty for everything. And Lori is sentenced to life in prison, while Chad is sentenced to death. While Lori's brother Alex, who was also involved in all this, he didn't get charged with anything because he died from blood clots before any of them got arrested, which is very suspicious timing. Oh, and also, the apocalypse never happened.
Not yet.
So this woman, she's losing her eyesight, and she'll do anything to get it back. So one day, she hears about this famous spiritual faith healer in Brazil, and she thinks maybe he can heal her eyes. So she travels to Brazil with some friends, and they get there, and she meets this faith healer, and she has a session with him, and he has her sit down in a chair, and he tilts her head back, and then he pulls out a scalpel, and he starts cutting right into her eye. Now the woman, let's call her mother-in-law, because she's my actual mother-in-law. But we'll get to her in a second. First, let's talk about the faith healer. So the faith healer, his name's John of God. And this dude claims that his God, or whoever, will heal people through him if he, does his hocus pocus and touches them. Of course, he has no formal training in medicine. He's never been to med school. In fact, he dropped out of elementary school in the 2nd grade. But regardless, he considers himself a healer. And one day, he just decides to travel around Brazil and tell people, hey, look, I can heal you. And people fall for it. In fact, they're really into it. And over time, he slowly builds a following. And his following becomes so big that he eventually builds a spiritual healing center in the middle of this small town to accommodate all of his visitors. And there, John of God becomes known for performing what he calls psychic surgeries, which is exactly what it sounds like. He uses no anesthesia, no sterilization, and he does these medical techniques on people that just don't make any damn sense. Like he shoves surgical forceps up people's noses to heal them, or he'll scrape the white of someone's eyeball with a scalpel in order to heal them. It's weird. Like someone will come in with back pain and he'll be like, let's scrape your eye with a scalpel, that'll heal you. But anyway, he claims this works. He claims that he's cured people's cancer. He claims that he's healed multiple sclerosis. He claims that he's helped people walk who couldn't previously walk. And while he's doing all this, he allegedly doesn't take any payment for all these healings. But he does, of course, accept donations. And he sells things to his followers, like special healing pills that are just placebo. And he also sells, and I'm not making this up, bottled holy water. And so by doing all this, John is starting to get really popular in Brazil. In fact, he gets so popular that ABC notices and they do a 1-hour special on him. And they treat him not as if he's a con man, which he is, but they treat him as if he's actually healing people. And specifically on this special, they interview a woman named Lisa Melman. And Lisa Melman, on this show, she gets on camera and she loudly declares that she has breast cancer, but that she's going to quit all her chemo and all her traditional cancer treatment, and instead she is only going to let John of God treat her. I don't know, I guess he's gonna stick forceps up her nose and that's gonna cure her breast cancer. Oh, but it gets worse. A few years later, after the ABC special, someone very influential learns about John of God. Oprah. And Oprah decides she's going to investigate and she's going to see herself if any of this is real. So she travels to Brazil and she spends a bunch of time with him. And she dedicates several episodes of her very popular TV show to praising him and his work and all these people he's allegedly healed. She even has Lisa Melman come on one of those episodes. And miraculously, Lisa claims that her breast cancer is now gone. She says her sessions with John of God cured her. And Oprah and her audience, they applaud this. But then, 2 years later, sadly, Lisa Melman dies. It turns out her breast cancer hadn't actually been cured. She just thought it had because that's what John of God told her. In fact, when she stopped her treatment, her cancer got progressively worse, and she was apparently in a lot of pain when she died. Of course, Oprah never gets on TV and mentions that part. Regardless, the damage has already been done. Oprah has endorsed John of God on her show twice and exposed him to an international audience. And from there, his business just explodes. People are flying in from all over the world trying to get healed by him. At this point, at his spiritual healing center, he's healing over 10,000 people a month. And he's making bank. He's getting tons of donations. He's selling trinkets and bottled holy water and those placebo pills left and right. And he's making more money than he's ever made. Allegedly, he's making over $14 million a year just on those pills alone. But then, in a weird twist, at some point, John of God gets diagnosed with stomach cancer himself. And so does he use his magical spiritual healing powers to heal his stomach cancer? No, of course not. He goes to a regular-ass doctor, and he gets normal treatment, and he gets surgery in a normal hospital. And he does 5 months of chemo like anyone else who would have stomach cancer. And of course, he recovers in like a year. And then he initially denies to everyone that that happened, because I guess him using traditional medicine is bad for his business. So anyway, my mother-in-law hears about this guy, and she wants to travel to Brazil to see him. See, my mother-in-law, she has an eye disorder called macular degeneration. And unfortunately, every year, she loses more and more of her vision. And she's lost most of it at this point. And she feels like, hey, maybe this John of God guy can help bring her eyesight back. And she's not dumb, she's not gullible, she's just desperate for a cure. So she comes to me and my wife, and she tells us that she's going to Brazil. And me and my wife are like, oh, please don't. You know, we're worried about what could happen to you. And this guy is obviously a fraud and a turd for telling people he can heal them. But unfortunately, she doesn't listen to us. She'll do anything to fix her eyes. So she goes to Brazil and she meets him. And she has a session with him and he sits her down in a chair and he tilts her head back or whatever. And he pulls out a scalpel and he does the thing where he scrapes the white of her eye with that scalpel. He then has her put a cover over that eye. And he tells her that in a few days, she can take that cover off and her vision will be healed. Somehow, in both eyes. Meanwhile, me and my wife are there in the US and we're just waiting to see that when that cover comes off, if her vision is actually healed. Now this is where the story goes off the rails. You aren't ready for this. Around this same time, a Dutch woman named Sahira, she's struggling with some mental trauma, and she sees this guy on Oprah's TV show, this guy named John of God, who claims he can heal people. So she's like, hey, maybe he can help heal my mental trauma. So she flies to Brazil and she shows up to the spiritual healing center and she waits in line and she sees him a couple of different times. One of those times she sees him, something exciting happens. John of God offers her a private consultation and she's super excited. So she waits until everyone's gone and then he invites her into his office. And while she's there, he takes her into the bathroom and he makes her hand touch him inappropriately. And afterwards, she's like, that was weird. And like, I don't know, maybe that's just part of the healing process. So she goes back later for another private session with him. And this time, when they're alone, he takes her into the bathroom again, and he straight up SAs her, like with a hard R. And here's the thing. The mental trauma that Sahira went to see him for was specifically sexual trauma. So she went to see him and told him about her sexual trauma, and his response was to SA her. And so poor Sahira doesn't know what to do. I mean, she feels violated and sick to her stomach. And she wants to tell someone, but at the same time, she believes this man is actually healing so many people. So she decides to not tell anyone. And she buries it deep down with all her other sexual trauma. Until 4 years later, the Me Too movement happens, and Sahira finally finds out she's not alone. So she posts about her experience with John of God on Facebook, and then she gets invited onto a Brazilian TV show to talk about it. And there, on that show, she meets a dozen other women, all who say that John of God SA'd them too. And this TV show airs, and suddenly, all of Brazil knows about these accusations, and everyone's talking about it, and bam, more women come forward. And so in response, the public prosecutor's office for the state, they're getting tons of accusations from a lot of different women. So they set up a hotline and an email address, specifically to receive all of these accusations that they're getting about John of God. And in the first day that hotline goes live, nearly 200 women come forward saying John of God SA'd them. And then in the weeks that follow, even more women come forward. And eventually, that number of women who claim that John of God SA'd them is over 600. And of course, John of God denies this. He claims that all 600 of these women are lying. But then, his own daughter comes forward. And she claims that he had SA'd her too, from when she was the age of 9 to 14. He would tell her that he was healing her, but instead, he would SA her. And she said that he finally stopped SAing her when she was 14, because that's when she got pregnant by another man. And when he found out that she was pregnant by another man, he beat her so hard that she lost the baby. In fact, his daughter said, and I quote, "My father is a monster." So anyway, all of this becomes public. And police are like, all right, it's time to get him, and they issue an arrest warrant for him. But John of God, he ain't going out easy. He immediately withdraws $9 million from his various bank accounts, and he goes on the run, and no one can find him. He's just hiding out somewhere, like he is gone. But about a week later, I guess the pressure is just too much for him, like he knows he's fucked, and he turns himself in, and they throw him in jail. Here's his mugshot. And eventually, he goes to trial, he's found guilty, and he's sent in jail. Just too much for him, like he eventually he goes to trial, he's found guilty, and he's sentenced to a grand total of 489 years in prison. Good for him. Okay, so at this point, I know what you're thinking. You're like, Ray, did he do anything horrible like that with your mother-in-law while she was there? First of all, let me just say, none of that SA stuff was public when she went to visit, so none of us knew what had been going on. And while she was there, lucky for her, she said she met him in a room full of people, there were no private sessions, so no, nothing inappropriate happened with her. But it's also worth noting that she eventually took her eye cover off. And so, did John of God end up healing her eyesight?
No.
No, he did not. Shocker. Shout out to Brazil. So this little kid, he might be one of the best con artists I've ever seen. Let me show you. Now his name is Juan Carlos, and he lives in Colombia, and so far he's had a really hard life. But Juan Carlos is about to do whatever it takes to succeed. So one day, he sets out to make that happen, and he heads to the local airport to catch a flight to Miami. But little Juan Carlos, he can't afford a plane ticket. So he sneaks onto the tarmac and he climbs onto a cargo plane. And he hides out in the wheel well. And he allegedly holds on real tight while the plane takes off and flies 3.5 hours from Cali, Colombia to Miami, Florida. Then the plane lands and allegedly Juan Carlos falls out of the wheel well. And he just lays there on the tarmac, unconscious. And airport staff, they eventually find him. And he's shivering and he's disoriented and he's just a wreck. But he tells them not that his name is Juan Carlos, but that his name is Guillermo, and that he's 13 and from Colombia, and that his parents had died, and that he doesn't have anyone else, so he fled to America. And his story just blows people away, because they feel sorry for him. And so the local media, they start covering it. Then a police officer in the area, this guy, Lozano, he's driving home one day and he hears the story on the radio that they found this 13-year-old kid who had been hiding in the wheel well of a plane. And Lozano is so moved, he goes and he volunteers to be Juan Carlos's temporary guardian while the state figures out what to do with him. So Juan Carlos goes and he lives with Lozano and his family. And this changes his life. Suddenly, he's not living in poverty anymore. And this middle-class lifestyle feels like wealth to him. And they've got all these nice things, and so he tells himself that soon he's gonna have nice things too. And within a few weeks of living with Lozano's family, Juan Carlos starts stealing. And things around the house go missing. Plus, he's been disappearing for days at a time. And Lozano and his wife, they start thinking that something isn't adding up about this kid. Then, one day, they get a call. And it's the Colombian consulate, who had just gotten some important information. Turns out, Juan Carlos isn't actually named Guillermo. He's named Juan Carlos. And he isn't some innocent kid. He's actually got a criminal record. And he isn't 13. He's actually 17. And his parents aren't dead. They're actually alive and well back in Colombia. And he probably didn't ride in the wheel well of that plane. It's more likely that he rode inside the plane with the cargo. And he just lied about it all because it made a better story. So Juan Carlos is just a little con artist, trying to con his way into the United States so that he can have a better life. And so, bam, they immediately detain him, and they deport him back to Colombia. Oh, but this isn't over for Juan Carlos, because for a moment, he got a taste of a much better life, and he'll do anything to get that back. So, over the years, Juan Carlos tries his best to scam his way out of Colombia and get back into the US and other countries, using different aliases and fake IDs, but he ends up getting deported, like a bunch of different times. And while all this is going on, Juan Carlos, he's there developing the perfect con. Here's his perfect con. Juan Carlos dresses up real nice, pretending to be a rich man, and he goes into a 5-star hotel, and he tries to make it look like he's a guest there. He hangs out in the lobby and at the hotel bar, and he'll chat with the staff a little bit just to make sure that they notice him. And as he's doing this, he also takes note of other guests. He'll memorize their name, he'll memorize their room number, then he'll go to reception, pretending to be that guest. And he'll say that he lost his room key. And reception, they'll recognize him like, oh, this guy, he's been hanging out in the lobby for a few days. Of course he's a guest here. So the hotel will let him in the room. And while he's there, he'll steal money and credit cards and jewelry and whatever he can get out of the guest's luggage. Then, to make it worse, he'll then call the hotel security desk and tell them he's locked out of his safe. And security, they'll come up to the room and they'll open the safe for him. And they don't question anything because he's already in the room. So of course they think it's his room. So then Juan Carlos takes everything from the safe and he leaves the hotel, a slightly richer man. And this con works. In fact, it works really well for him. So Juan Carlos does it repeatedly, hotel after hotel after hotel, just raking it in. Until one day in London, boom, he gets arrested for using a credit card he had stolen. But Juan Carlos, he's ready for this. He's been thinking about it a while, and he gives police a fake name and he skips bail and leaves town. And then a year later, he's back in London, pulling off his same con, and then bam, he gets arrested again for using another stolen credit card. This time, he gives them a different fake name and a fake ID, and he ends up getting off with a small fine because they don't realize he's the same guy they arrested the year before. So Juan Carlos continues with this pattern. He travels the world using fake names, fake IDs, and robbing hotels. But a few years later, he makes his way back to London again, and there he hits 4 more hotels and leaves with over $100,000 worth of cash and jewelry. Now, at this point, a couple of London detectives have started to take notice. This detective, Swindells, and this other detective, Plowman. So Swindells and Plowman, they've started to piece a lot of this together, and they end up connecting a bunch of these robberies back to the thief, Juan Carlos. Meanwhile, old Juan Carlos, he's already fled. He's living the good life. He's got money, he's got clothes, he finally has nice things like he's always wanted. But it's just not enough. So Juan Carlos keeps going. And within a couple of years, he ends up in Las Vegas, where he pulls off his infamous scam and he ends up stealing $350,000 worth of cash and jewelry. And one of the hotel rooms he robs is allegedly Celine Dion's room.
No!
So that's fun. And then, about a year later, Juan Carlos is back in London again. And he hits up even more hotels. But then, one night, Swindells, he's out, and he's walking back from a bar he was just at. And he just happens to stop outside of a supermarket. And he sees a man leaving that supermarket. A man wearing a long leather jacket. And Swindells recognizes him. Because by sheer fucking coincidence, he just crossed paths with the Juan Carlos. Now, Swindells has never seen Juan Carlos in person, only in mugshots. But he's been working on this case a long time. He knows it's him. So then, pow, Swindells arrests him. And he goes to trial, and he's sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. Oh, but this story isn't over, because Juan Carlos really likes his nice things. So 3 months later, he's in prison, and he happens to have a dentist appointment. And he ends up charming the prison guards to let him go out to his dentist appointment alone. I guess this is some kind of like open prison where they're not as strict. And so they just let him go to the dentist alone. And of course, he flees. And from there, somehow, he makes his way to Dublin, where he steals a credit card and pulls his infamous scam in yet another hotel. And that is where he screws up, because that puts this Irish detective on the case. This guy, McGlynn. Now McGlynn, he goes and he looks at CCTV footage from some of the stores that Juan Carlos had used that stolen credit card at. And pretty quickly, he identifies the thief in the footage. He knows it's Juan Carlos, the same guy who had walked out of prison not too long before. So McGlynn investigates further, and he concludes that Juan Carlos must have just gotten to Dublin. So he's likely staying in a cheap hostel in the city where he can keep a low profile. So McGlynn spends 2 days searching all these hostels in Dublin. And then he finally finds Juan Carlos hiding out in a hostel with tons of items he had already stolen. And so kapow, he gets arrested again. Here's one of his mugshots. And he gets sentenced to 2 years in prison, but then an Irish judge rules that he can be extradited to France to face even more charges there, because he robbed a bunch of hotels there too. But then, while he's there in France, he's released temporarily, and then just like that, Juan Carlos disappears again. A few years later, he's busted by a customs agent at a gas station in Vermont after he had entered the U.S. illegally. And he's sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. And after that, he gets out and he's arrested again in a hotel in Hong Kong. Then he's arrested in France again for robbing another hotel, over $200,000 worth of cash and jewelry. And from there, he's sentenced to prison again for 15 months. This dude is allergic to freedom. But now he's out, and his current whereabouts are actually unknown. But I'm just gonna take a wild guess and say he's probably still out there robbing more hotel rooms.
Why are they so
shout out to
dumb?
Colombia, London, Miami, Dublin, Las Vegas, France, Hong Kong, and Vermont.
Wow.
So this teenage kid, he commits so many crimes that he's about to run from police for years, steal a plane, and escape to another country. Now his name's Colton, and he's only 12, and his life sucks. He lives in a small trailer in the woods on a little island off the coast of Washington. And his mom is an addict, and so he mostly has to take care of himself. So he spends most his days in the woods, alone, reading about airplanes, because one day he wants to be a pilot. Now eventually he starts breaking into neighboring houses, stealing things, mostly food, but over time he starts stealing other things, a laptop and credit cards. And interestingly, he often doesn't wear shoes for some reason, like he does most of this barefoot. And so this barefoot kid is always in and out of trouble. And one day, he doesn't show up for a mandatory court date, and bam, the police start looking for him. And Colton learns they're looking for him, and so he hides out in the woods for like 6 months. He finds vacation homes, and he breaks into those, and he sleeps there. Or he'll steal food and camping supplies, and he'll sleep out in the forest. But then, eventually, boom, police catch him. And they convict him, and he's sentenced to 3 years in juvenile detention. And of course, Colton hates being locked up. He can't ever be a pilot while he's in detention. So, a little over a year later, he sneaks out an unlocked window, and he escapes. So now he's on the run again, and he goes back to the area where he used to live, and he starts sleeping in the woods and breaking into vacation homes again. So he's constantly on the move, and stealing things like food and supplies and cars. And this goes on for months, before finally police close in on him. One day he's driving a Mercedes he had stolen, and they spot him because he's driving like an asshole, and they go to pull him over in a parking lot, and he jumps out of the car while it's still moving, and he takes off and runs into the woods. And so police search the car, and they find a backpack he had stolen and a digital camera he had stolen, and on that camera they find this selfie he took. Then Colton steals a boat, and he drives it from his island to a different island. And on the new island, he breaks into all kinds of homes and businesses again, and he steals a bunch more shit. So this guy's been in and out of trouble for years at this point. He's like 16 or 17 years old at this time. And if you're like, Ray, how could a teenager cause this much chaos? Like, wouldn't he want friends or like a girlfriend? What exactly is Colton getting out of all of this? Well, let me just say that this kid never had a chance at a normal life. Starting from when he was a little kid, his upbringing messed him up. And I'm not trying to invoke sympathy for him. I'm just saying that the home life he grew up in, the environment he grew up in, was an absolute disaster. When he was a toddler, his dad was a drug addict. So he was raised mostly by his mom, who was apparently a raging alcoholic, and was extremely neglectful to him. His neighbors later said they called Child Protective Services more than once because they believed that he was being abused or neglected. Child Protective Services actually showed up to his place 12 different times. One of those times, they actually even removed him from the home for a period of time. So yeah, all of this set his life up for an eventual disaster. That's why he was living in the woods and running around barefoot for so long as a kid. I mean, what else was he supposed to do? Anyway, so Colton is still out there, and he's still on the run from police. And by now, his story is starting to catch on in the media. I mean, this teenage burglar who police can't seem to catch. And he's starting to get a little reputation. But Colton, he isn't too worried about that. He's way too preoccupied with his lifelong dream of becoming a pilot. And during this time, he decides he's gonna make that happen. So he goes and he breaks into a small airplane hangar, and he steals a single propeller plane, and he manages to get it running, and he actually gets it in the air. Now, he has no formal flight training, only reading piloting manuals and watching instructional videos on his computer that he had stolen, but he somehow managed to get this plane flying, and he keeps it in the air for 3.5 hours before he finally crashes it on a Native American reservation in mainland Washington. About a year later, he steals another plane, but this one he only flies it about 10 miles before he lands it correctly this time. No crashes. 2 weeks later, he breaks into another hangar and steals a third plane in Idaho, and he flies it 250 miles back to Washington, and this one he crash lands in a field. Meanwhile, the legend of Colton and his crimes are growing. I mean, he's 17 now, and he's been on the run from police for like years. And he's stealing boats and planes, and they just can't seem to catch him. So he's starting to get fans online. And because he often doesn't wear shoes, they call him the Barefoot Bandit. Someone even starts a Facebook fan page for him, and that fan page gets over 100,000 followers. While one company starts making t-shirts with Colton's face on them. People are even writing songs about him and putting them on YouTube. I mean, dude is blowing up. And of course, all this sudden attention, it starts to put a lot of heat on him. And by now, the FBI is involved in this manhunt, looking for him. But Colton, he's like, whatever. He's still out there robbing houses and stealing cars. And so another year passes. And he decides, okay, there's too much heat on me. It's time to steal another plane and get the hell out of the country. But first, he has to find the right plane. So he jacks a boat and he drives it to mainland Oregon. And from there, he goes to a small airport, and he doesn't find the plane he wants, so then he just steals a car. And from there, he goes to 2 more airports, and he still doesn't find the right plane. Then he tries an airport in South Dakota, and nope, still doesn't find the right plane. Then he just keeps on stealing car after car, hopping from state to state, breaking into airport after airport, looking for the right one that has the plane he wants. And after driving over 2,000 miles through 9 different states and almost a dozen stolen cars, Colton hits up a small airport in Indiana, and he finally finds the plane he's looking for, the Cessna 400. And bam, he straight up jacks it, and he takes off, and he's in the air, and he flies 11 hours, over 1,200 miles, from Indiana to Great Abaco Island in the Bahamas. And once he's there, he kind of crash lands in shallow waters near the shore. That crash landing triggers the plane's emergency locator beacon, which is how the FBI ultimately learns that Colton is now in the Bahamas. But Colton has no idea, because within hours, he's breaking into local houses and businesses again, and stealing cash and food and all kinds of stuff. Then he steals another boat, and he flees to the nearby island of Eureka, where he hopes to blend in with the constant crowd of tourists there. But unfortunately for Colton, he can't blend into the crowd. He's just too famous now. And within a few days, locals start to recognize him as the Barefoot Bandit, and they tip off local police. So pretty quickly, Colton finds himself in yet another stolen boat, speeding away as Bahamian police chase him in like a Miami Vice type boat chase. And as he's hauling ass and getting away, kaboom! He high centers his boat on a sandbar. He is stuck. And as he's trying to unstick his ride, of course, police roll right up on him. And they open fire on his boat, taking out his engine. And there is where Colton, the Barefoot Bandit, finally surrenders. So then, bam, they arrest him. Here's his mugshot. And Colton gets charged with all kinds of stuff, and ultimately he gets sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. Oh, but here's the best part. Apparently Colton's story is so interesting, he's able to sell the movie rights to his life to 20th Century Fox for a whopping $1.3 million. But unfortunately, as part of the punishment for all his crimes, the court ordered that he's not allowed to profit from his story. So he doesn't get to keep any of that money. All of it has to go to pay back his victims, the people he stole from. And apparently he's out of prison now, he served his time, and he just works a regular job, so good for him. One night, this woman, her name's Ellie, she goes out with some friends. And while she's out, she meets this guy, Jordan. And they're all drinking and they're having a good time. And by the end of the night, Jordan ends up taking Ellie home. Except that Jordan doesn't actually take her home. He takes her somewhere else, somewhere she doesn't recognize. And there is where he essays her. But unfortunately, she doesn't report it to police. She says she's too afraid. 2 months later, Jordan shows up one night to her apartment. And for some reason, she lets him in. And there is where he pulls a knife on her and he beats her up and he essays her again. But this time, after he leaves, she does go and report it to police. And luckily, she has proof. Crazy enough, she has screenshots from Jordan's Snapchat messages, where he openly admits that he essayed her. So police, they eventually go and arrest Jordan. But then he gets out on bail. And one night, while he's out on bail, he breaks into Ellie's house and he essays her again. So she tells police, and police go and they arrest him again. And they throw him in jail, and he's there for about 10 weeks before they ultimately let him go due to lack of evidence. Now, since Ellie has the police's ear, she feels it's the right time to confess something else to them. She goes and tells them about another separate incident that happened to her. Years before, back when Ellie was 12, she had met this much older guy at sort of a family gathering, and his name is Mo. So she and Mo, they become friends, and Mo eventually starts trafficking her, taking her from place to place and forcing her to do horrible things that I won't get into. And Ellie wasn't the only one. She says Mo has done this to tons of other girls, at least 60 other girls, in fact. And he's involved in some kind of larger trafficking ring. And so Mo trafficking Ellie, this goes on for years, from the time she's 12 and to when she's well into her teens. And of course, Ellie has Snapchat messages to prove all of this too. So she shows all these messages to police. So police see this and they fear for Ellie's safety. So they put her in a hotel so that none of the traffickers she just outed can find her. Well, unfortunately for her, some of the traffickers she outed eventually do end up finding her. And they order her to get on a train and go to Blackpool immediately. So she does. And in Blackpool, she meets up with Mo, the original trafficker. And Mo ends up taking her to 4 different hotels where she is essayed multiple times by a bunch of different men. Now, police, they eventually notice Ellie's missing. And they go to Blackpool and they find her and they bring her back to the original hotel. They also eventually arrest Mo and they throw him in jail. 2 weeks later, police take Ellie back to Blackpool. And they're like, okay, show us where the traffickers took you. Let's retrace all your steps so we can finally bust this trafficking ring. And Ellie's like, alright. So they spend 2 days driving her around town. And Ellie points out a few places to them, but the locations she's pointing to and the details she's giving them are suddenly really vague.
Was it on that route that you took us on, or was it somewhere else?
I don't know.
Not sure.
And by the end of this trip, police have no more information than when they started. And it's at this point that they look at Ellie and they start to get suspicious. So they go and they search Ellie's phone. And they find that, yeah, she actually had been at a hotel in Blackpool. But it's a hotel that she herself booked, which doesn't line up with her trafficking story. They also find CCTV footage of her shopping at various local stores in Blackpool, which also doesn't line up with her trafficking story. And this is when police realized that Ellie hadn't been trafficked at all. She hadn't been SA'd at all. She made it all up. All of it, all the way back to Jordan, the guy who she accused of SAing her 3 different times. Even the Snapchat messages that she would show police as proof, they were all fake. She just made them up herself. She would even go as far as to beat herself up and put marks on herself to show police as proof. And it is all complete bull. And so police are like, all right, this woman is crazy. Let's go arrest her. So they go to arrest her, but suddenly Ellie is missing. No one knows where she's at. No one can find her. Meanwhile, Ellie has taken a train to Preston. And there, in the town center, she befriends a random, really drunk dude. His name's Oliver. So Ellie and Oliver, they immediately hit it off. And they start flirting, and they kiss a little, and they kind of hook up, and then they exchange numbers, and they part ways. Then Ellie gets on a train, and she goes back home. And police, they show up there, because they've been looking for her. And she tells police that Oliver, the guy she just hooked up with, she tells them that he trafficked her. She claims that some traffickers forced her to go to Preston and meet up with Oliver, and that Oliver took her somewhere where they met up with some other men, and those other men SA'd her. And that then some of those men beat her up. And of course, she has marks all over her. Marks that she made herself. So police, they have to go track down Oliver and investigate him, just in case any of these crazy accusations turn out to be true. Regardless, boom, they arrest Ellie, and they charge her with perverting the course of justice. But pretty quickly, Ellie gets out on bail. And once she's out, she's right back to her old tricks. Because one night she goes to a local store and she buys a hammer. And a few days after that, she takes that hammer and bam! She smacks herself with it, right across the face. And then she does it again and again and again, until her eye's all red and swollen. Then she takes that hammer and smashes her own finger, until it's partially severed. And then she goes out to some random field and waits until police, they eventually find her. And of course, she lies and tells them this whole story about how she was trafficked again, and then taken to a house, and then SA'd by a bunch of random men, and then they beat her up. So of course, police, they take her to the hospital because she's all beat up. But once she's discharged from the hospital, she goes home, and she takes pictures of herself all beat up. Then she gets on Facebook and posts those pictures. And she writes a long, detailed post basically claiming not that she hit herself with a hammer for attention, but that the night before, some gang of Pakistani groomers trafficked her and beat her up. And so then people on the internet see this crazy long post and these horrible pictures, and they have no idea that police had already determined that Ellie just makes all this stuff up. So her friends on Facebook, they see this post and they believe her, and they start sharing it, and her post starts to blow up. People are sharing it over and over again, and it goes viral. And someone starts a Facebook group called Justice for Ellie, and that Facebook group gets 100,000 followers, and they're quickly selling merchandise to help her out with a purple elephant logo that says Justice for Ellie, and there are